We are about to be in May, and there's a lot of fun fishing stuff going on in the world of bass fishing right now. There's a ton of content out on tournament fishing. You have the Bassmaster Elite Series, who just started on Santee Cooper. You have the EQ Bassmaster Open Series that seems like going to a new lake every couple of weeks now for the rest of the year, so there'll be plenty of content with that. That's an exciting race of all the up-and-coming talent or some of the older talent that is trying to qualify for the Bassmaster Elite Series. You get to see those guys just grind it out and try to qualify for the top fishing tier. You also have the Major League Fishing BPT guys that are just catching giant bass right now on Caney Creek and Bussey Lake in Louisiana. And then you have the Major League Fishing Invitationals that are also heated up. I think they're on their fourth event coming up soon. So there's a lot of good content out there if you want to learn something from tournament fishing. And every other circuit seems like it's up and running now and everything's just in full force and the fishing's good. So that's fun. The fish haven't seen a lot of lures, and the fishing is typically good when they haven't seen a lot of lures. So let's dive into three things that I just want to talk about this week. Jig fishing. What I've learned about jig fishing recently, we all know it, but I think it needs to be hammered down a little more because I found some stuff out about it that after doing a lot of research on tournament wins for single day tournaments, I've realized that a jig wins a lot more than I ever thought it did or gave it credit. So let's dive into that first and foremost, and then I want to dive into really big jigs, 1 ounce jigs, those monster jigs that you don't ever get heard talk about. People don't ever talk about them. Heard talk about. Talked about, or you hear, rather. So let's dive into jig fishing. So I've been reading all the single day tournament wins for the BFLs, which the BFLs is like a AA regional level. There's a lot of talent that just doesn't want to move up and pay bigger money and fish bigger tournaments, so they stay at this level. Winning that tournament is one of the hardest tournaments to win. Amongst fishermen, there's a lot of respect for the guys that win those tournaments. There are guys that have won 11, 9, 8, 7 tournaments in the BFL division. And you may have never heard of those guys, but amongst guys that understand different lakes and understand bass fishing as a whole, know how good those guys are on certain lakes. And a jig just comes up. If you read those reports on what it took to win, what was the winning technique, the winning lure, a jig is almost always mentioned. Now, a lot of lures win tournaments, but a jig is like 80 to 90% of tournaments are won on a jig. And it's like, is it the guy? He's just a good jig fisherman and he's going to win no matter what? Or is there just something to that? And I really believe that for one-day tournaments, it's really good because it's a high risk, high reward. Now, days you are going to pay. You're not going to catch them. You're going to throw it all day, and it's just not going to work. And there's days where the jig is going to pay major dividends, and it's going to be the tournament-winning bait. But for that reason, you don't see it a whole lot in multi-day tournaments. Now, there's a lot of money made on it the first couple of days of the tournament, but you don't see all of that typically in the TV show or the live or the exposure because they don't have cameras on everybody. So a lot of money is won early on in the tournament on a jig, and then that kind of fizzles off. It's not a consistent way. You can go out and catch 18 pounds on it the first day of the tournament, catch one fish the second day. That's just jig fishing, and that's just lakes that have a lot of pressure on them. And it doesn't matter if this is a high-pressure lake before the fishermen get there, but after the fishermen have been there through the practice period, 3, 5, 6, 7 days, whatever it may be, and then a couple days of the tournament, everyone's catching those fish, they're putting them in their boat, and the lake is drying up. It's getting a lot tougher to get a bite, and the jig is the first thing that typically goes when the fishing's really tough and the fish have seen a lot of jigs. So it doesn't get the mainstream exposure for that reason, but if you look at these smaller tournaments, by smaller I mean just less days, guys are practicing less in the BFLs, and then they're fishing just a one-day tournament. That makes a lot less pressure. I mean, like a quarter of the pressure that you would see in a multi-day tournament where guys are practicing for extended periods of time. Most guys in these working man regional level tournaments like the BFLs, you just don't see nearly the amount of pressure from the practice period. Some guys will practice a day, maybe 2 days. 3 days is very rare. When you get up to the AAA level and the upper echelons of bass fishing where they're throwing down a lot of money, guys will come there, fish for a week. Guys will be there the week before for a week. It will be a lot of pressure on the lake that the lakes just aren't used to getting. So for that reason, you don't see it so much in that AAA level, but you do see it a ton in the single day level, and it just wins a lot. So we've all known that a jig catches big fish. We all known that it's a powerful tool. It's the most basic fishing lure that there is. So for the fact that it doesn't get its respect, I don't think that's the case. I think it does get its respect, but maybe not to that degree where when you start looking at those things and you're reading those reports of what wins, it's just like jig, 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 jig. So all right, so let's talk about a jig that you don't hear a whole lot about. And I don't know if it's because maybe some of the great jig fishermen have just stopped using it, or it's just one of those baits where they've been burned by it too many times. That seems to happen to me. If I get burned by something, I don't care how many times I've done well on it. If I get burned over and over and over on it, I just kind of get real worried about using it. I don't want to fall down that hole again and lock something in my hand that's going to cause me to have a really bad tournament. So I don't throw it nearly as much. So you don't see this a whole lot, and this could be, a kind of a double-edged sword. It's a big bait. It's a 1 ounce jig, and you don't see it a lot because it doesn't work in all types of cover. It's situational on the cover that you're going to fish. And then again, it covers all the other jig positives and negatives. A lot of times you're going to get burned by this, but then there's a lot of times where you might catch the biggest fish in the lake because that's what a jig does. So a 1 ounce jig, I use it in a couple different settings. And when I talk about this is a bait that typically will not work in certain situations, what I'm referring to is any type of bottom that has a lot of muck on it. It may be leaves, it may be grass. If you don't have a clean bottom, this is going to be a headache. This is going to be a troubling way to catch a bass and probably won't work because efficiency and making as many casts as you can make with this is super important. If you're constantly pulling muck or slime or leaves off the bottom of your jig, or it's just not going into the cover correctly, maybe the water's too shallow. There's a lot of situations where this just won't work. So be very careful when you implement this 1 ounce jig, but this is a bait that they don't see a lot. The bass are not used to a bait falling this quickly. This is a lot like when you're punching. You would typically need 1.5 ounces, or let's say 1 ounce, to get your bait to fall through a mat. It goes to the bottom like a rock. That gets you a lot of bites. Now you need to implement that same speed when you're flipping just targets like trees or some type of emergent vegetation. So the 1 ounce jig, I like it with a horizontal line tie. Anytime, see how that line tie comes out horizontally. I like it anytime I'm flipping some type of tree or some type of reeds, if it's in a lake that has grass, like cattails, but I need a clean bottom. So when I'm thinking of trees, I want that tree to be on some type of place where current is sometimes prevalent there. That'll keep that bottom clean, or uncover that filters the bottom, like what I call bulrushes or buggy whips, round pencil reeds. They typically have a really clean bottom around them. That plant just filters the water, filters the bottom. So that is typically a hard bottom, great pre-spawn area in your Florida lakes. So you have seen that 1 ounce jig with the double weed guard. The Medlock is the guy that has made it famous, but everyone down there uses this when this bite gets right. And that is great in those round reeds, but it's good in the flat ones too. And it's just a great way to get fish to bite. Everyone uses it down there. But it also works as you move further north. It doesn't get nearly the amount of pressure because it hasn't been put in enough good fishermen's hands. But I will tell you this is a bait that is going to win tournaments. If people use it, it would win tournaments. And what I've heard a long time ago, and this makes a lot of sense, is around cypress trees. You think of cypress knees and all the other stuff that's around that tree, it's also filtering out the bottom in the water. So you typically have a nice clean bottom around cypress trees. This 1 ounce jig with this double weed guard is great around that because you do have knees that come out all around that tree, and it can be tough trying to throw a crankbait or flip a Texas rig around those. So that double weed guard just makes your day a whole lot more efficient. But it's the same thing. You have that filtration of the bottom. You have a nice hard bottom around those trees. And that 1 ounce jig is just something that those fish haven't seen. These are very obvious targets. There's a lot of wacky rigs. There's a lot of crankbaits, spinner baits thrown around these trees. A 1 ounce jig could be something that gets those fish to react when they won't do anything else. Now, I also like a 1 ounce jig when you are flipping grass that, again, has a clean bottom. Deeper grass, like hydrilla that's growing out in 4 to 6, 8, 10 feet, or deeper really, but I like at least 4 or 5 feet. That is a great way to get those fish that have seen a bunch of chatterbaits, they've seen a bunch of worms. This shooting by their head at one of the faster speeds of that they're only seeing bluegill and stuff at that speed. Drop this by them. Just that quick silhouette of it going by their face gets them to react a lot. And when I'm flipping any type of submergent vegetation, it's going to be a vertical line tie. You almost want that line tie that you would have on your swim jigs. You want that bait falling really as quick and as weedless like as you possibly can. You want it to shoot down into that grass, and typically they're going to bite that on the first fall, pop it up a couple times, and just keep dropping it. It's a lot like punching, but instead of putting it through a mat, you're flipping it on the edge when you have those fish that haven't pushed up in the mats and they're out on the edge in 4 to 6 to 8 to 10, 12 feet of water, and they're just kind of relating to the structure, the deeper water leading up to the flat. That 1 ounce jig is great for that type of fishing. I'm trying to think of fishermen that you have seen do this on TV, and Greg Hackney on Cayuga would be one of the ones that I would think of. I think it was 2014. And then you've also seen Hackney flip bushes, deeper bushes, on Lake Texoma with the 1 ounce jig. So this works. It doesn't just work in Florida. It's won a bunch of tournaments in Florida, but works everywhere. So that is the jig. I think that needed to be said. Now let's dive into some forward-facing sonar, just food for thought type of stuff. I know forward-facing sonar is great. I'm not going to bash it. Whatever it's going to do to this sport, let it be. It's going to happen. I mean, AI is going to happen. So whatever happens, happens. But a thought that came into my head, I've watched a few different videos. Todd Castledine put out a video on forward-facing sonar and snagging fish. And I know John Cruz has put out some videos. And you're seeing fish that aren't hooked in the mouth. Now, those fish they're trying to eat your bait, but somehow they're getting hooked, around their head and in their fins and on their side. They're trying to eat the bait. I mean, they're not getting snagged. I think it's impossible to snag a fish with forward-facing sonar, a bass, for that. But it goes back to the bed fishing and sight fishing rule. Now, the fish that are snagged in tournaments when you're bed fishing, those fish aren't trying to be snagged. They're relating to that bed. They're swimming in and out of the bed. They're locking down on the bed. They're looking at your lure. They come up. They pick it up. They maybe pick it up kind of weird. They kind of have it in the side of their mouth, like they pick up just the weight. And then when you pull, you're just pulling that hook. You know, the weight is in their mouth and the hook is on the outside of their mouth. And when you pull into them, you see that fish pick up your bait. When you pull into them, you pull that hook into the outside of their mouth. Now, you weren't trying to snag that fish, but it's not a legal catch. You have to throw it back. What is the difference between that and you seeing a fish in a brush pile on forward-facing sonar? He's sitting there. He's relating to that brush pile like a bass would be relating to a bed. He may swim out of the pile. He may swim back to the pile, but he's not going to go too far away from the pile. He is going to be relating to that brush pile. You throw your jerk bait over to him. You see him. Maybe he swims to it, swims back to the pile. He's doing the same things that fish do when they're on a bed. You're using that location, if it's a brush pile or a bed, to make sure that fish is not going to leave there. He's locked on that piece of cover or whatever you may call it. And you keep just making the fish mad until he bites. Well, what's the difference between a bed fisherman that accidentally hooks a fish outside of the mouth? The fish ate it. You set the hook and it was hooked in the, outside, somewhere out on the outside of their face. And a fish that's on a brush pile and you keep throwing to the brush pile, he keeps nipping at it or swimming towards it. And, maybe he's hitting it with a closed mouth, whatever it may be. You're visually seeing that fish. He's not getting it in his mouth and you're hooking him on the outside of the mouth. You're seeing him in real time. And what is the difference? I mean, what is really the difference? You have a fish that is not leaving a specific spot, so you can make numerous casts to that same fish over and over and over, the exact same way you would on forward-facing sonar to a brush pile, or if you were seeing one on a bed with your eyes in real time. You're seeing them in real time on your screen. Technology has gotten so good that it's not seeing him on downscan, seeing him on side imaging, and seeing a delayed image for that. You're seeing him in real time. You're watching him try to eat your lure, and then he's being hooked outside of the mouth. It's a strange thing that's going on, but I think there's a few rules with the advancement of technology that need to be revisited. Because if you think about, these rules in California and other places that state it doesn't matter if you're sight fishing or not, they have to be hooked inside the mouth. If you read up on that, most of those rules were put in place by the government to protect other species, not so much bass, because a lot of bass fishing lures are treble hooks, and anyone that's ever caught a fish on a treble hook or caught a bass on a treble hook, you just know that those fish aren't going to get hooked inside the mouth with those hooks. That's just not how treble hook baits work. Well, if we really want to flatten this curve with forward-facing sonar and make it fair to people that don't want to use forward-facing sonar, there should be some type of rules that put in place that these fish need to be hooked inside the mouth. I just think that the bed fishing one gets a bad rap because you can see that fish and you can look at it. Well, now we can see that fish and look at it and see its behavior and just over and over and over again. The same way you're doing with the bed fish, there's not a huge difference between the two. There was a big difference when you're looking at a delayed image, but now you're seeing the fish in perfect real time. I think that rule needs to be revisited, or there needs to be a discussion about that rule. So let me know in the comments what you guys think about not necessarily snagging fish, but seeing a fish lock down a piece of cover and keep throwing to it with forward-facing sonar. Should that be hooked inside the mouth? And good luck to you guys, and I'll see you on the water.